Today, we become legends.
From the weakest release ever seen in Smite to one of the most dominant solo laners in 2023, this is how Ravana made the greatest comeback in Smite history. The year is 2015, Smite Season 2 had just launched not long ago and a brand new warrior was entering the battleground, the supposedly invulnerable Demon King Ravana, but at release, he was more of a wet noodle. While his kit at release was similar to now, there were a few key differences that were changed over the years to make him significantly stronger and play better overall. Firstly, Ravana's passive was very different. He still stacked up a chain of blows over time, but instead of giving him a health shield that makes every solo laner want to change role in the modern day, it boosted the damage of his next Prana Onslaught instead, up to 60%. That sounds good, right? 1.6 times damage on an ability that already hits kinda hard should make him chunk in fights, right? Well, not exactly, when you factor in that his one's damage was roughly 40% lower than it is now, so in reality, even with the absolute maximum passive benefit, this ability only hit for about 30 more damage than it does now with no benefits. And that was his entire passive, no shield, all it did was make the one do the damage it does now. Oh, and also, this version of the passive only stacked up from basic attacks, not abilities like it now does, so it was even harder to get up to that stat cap in combination with the stacks being less useful than the shield he gets now. Another key difference on release for the Demon King was that his 2 provided only damage immunity, not CC immunity. Anyone who has played Smite for more than a week knows that beads is practically essential on any non-tank, which shows how important CC immunity is in the game. On release, this ability would very often just get eaten by a hard CC, which stopped it and made him take damage again. Even against stuff like a Kraken, yes, you immune the damage, but you still get knocked up and stunned, which makes you take as much damage as the Kraken would have dealt to you, if not more. The passive and the 2 were pretty bad, but they pale in comparison to Ravana's release ultimate, which is quite possibly the worst ultimate we've ever seen in Smite. It is somewhat familiar to his modern day ult, but instead of a leap, it was a lock-on that required line of sight, so no ganking over walls or anything like that. When you leap onto the target, other enemies dealt 40% reduced damage to Ravana, but his target still dealt full damage. This felt really awkward to use because you wanted to ult into the backline on a mage or hunter and burst them down, but then that person you ulted still shreds you for full damage. So ideally you'd want to ult like a backline support and then go on the mid or ADC with the 40% damage reduction, but that just felt super bad to do. Oh, and the cherry on top, this is the damage Mystic Rush dealt at release. Yeah, this ultimate dealt less damage than almost every basic ability in the game, never mind other ults. I wouldn't be surprised if this was actually the lowest damage ability in the whole game at that point, and it was an ultimate. But don't worry, as we all know, this ult didn't stay like that forever, so let's move into all the insane changes Ravana has got over the years and how his grand comeback transpired. So in patch 2.9, which by the way is the same patch he released in, yeah, they didn't even wait one patch to give this guy some insane buffs, they hotfixed him in the very same patch, that's how bad release Ravana was. In this patch, his passive was buffed so that it now gave 80% bonus damage to his 1 at max stacks, aka it then did probably about 20% more damage than it does now, and again, he needed 8 basic attacks before casting his 1 to do this, since the passive didn't stack off ability hits back then, only basics. Oh, and I don't think I mentioned this before, but there was a timer of 5 seconds on the passive stacks back then. They didn't just stay forever like now, so you couldn't really build up 8 stacks in lane, then rotate and bot someone for 400 on your engage with the 1, because if you waited more than 5 seconds, you lost all those stacks. So most of the time, you actually had to engage, hit 8 basic attacks, then use your 1, just for it to do barely more damage than it does now with none of the convoluted boosting required. A bigger change in this hotfix though was his 2 getting CC immunity as well as damage immunity. I still remember the absolute jubilation of the Smite community when this change was made, as it was being asked for from the second they revealed Ravana. It might sound like a small change, but this ability literally became twice as good after this hotfix. His 3's cooldown was reduced and they also changed the heal on it from a percentage of damage dealt to the flat heal it still is today. I think I somehow haven't mentioned this yet, but Ravana was a warrior at release, so having a heal that was based on damage dealt on an ability that only did 215 plus 55% scaling was not very useful. The flat heal was a significant buff. And finally for this hotfix patch, they increased the mitigations on the ultimate from 40% at all ranks to 40% scaling up to 60%, and also made it double your current chain of blows on cast. This helped, but was not even close to enough to make this ultimate any good. 2 patches later in 2.11, Ravana received some more buffs to his 2 and 3. The 2's damage was bumped up, but more importantly, the cooldown was reduced by 2 seconds at all ranks, meaning this complete damage and CC immunity was now on a 10-second cooldown at max rank. That's 6 seconds with max CDR. This is actually the strongest this ability has ever been. been, and I thank the Smite gods that it's not on a 6-second cooldown in modern Smite where Ravana is already dominating. His 3 also got some healing and damage buffs too in this patch, and again in patch 2.13. But now, the moment every Ravan player had been waiting for since his release, in patch 2.20, Ravan's rework took place. All of the buffs he had gotten beforehand were just band-aids trying to fix the core problem inherent in his design. But these changes are what made Ravan truly a threat and took him pretty much into his modern design, minus a couple of things. His passive went from a useless piece of shit that only made his 1 deal the damage it now does by default to the % health shield it is today, while also making the change that abilities now stack it as well as basics, and it lost the 5-second timer that made it pretty much unusable in its previous iteration. The shield at this time was only 5% max health, but as we know, that would be improved upon later. Even at 5%, it was a damn sight better than the garbage he had as a passive before. The 1 in this patch was also omega buffed. I mean, just look at this. It was improved in 5 different ways in just 1 patch. The damage and scaling were increased to compensate for the loss of his old passive, but the slow was massively improved as it was now 25% flat instead of scaling from 10 to 20%. At rank 1, this ability felt like it didn't even slow at all, so this was a huge change. The duration of that slow was also increased, and the range of the ability was too. Prana Onslaught was now way stronger than it was before, and he actually had a passive. But finally, the big one, Ravan's ultimate was changed, so it was no longer a lock-on and could go over walls, while they also increased the damage. A lot. I mean, just look at that. Both base and scaling were almost tripled in this one change, and the only reason that it didn't make it literally one-shot people is because of how utterly useless the damage was before this change. At this point, it still had the choose a target feature, so anyone you actually hit with the ult still dealt full damage to you, while others dealt less, making it still pretty useless in a 1v1 scenario. After this rework, Ravan was insanely strong. If you think Ravan breaks the game in the current meta, he was arguably just as strong, if not stronger comparatively at this point in Season 3. His 2 was still on a 6-second cooldown at max CDR, his 1 was still on a 6-second cooldown base, and there were 7 seasons worth of power creep that hadn't been added to the game yet. So in relation to his peers at the time, this might have been the strongest Ravan ever was. Naturally, some nerfs came for him following this patch. Patch 3.1 nerfed the scaling on his 1 and cooldown of his 3, patch 3.3 increased the cooldown of his 1 and the cooldown of his 2 dramatically, and patch 3.17 increased the cooldown of his 1 again while nerfing the healing of his 3. However, in Season 4, all of that nerfing was undone in a single patch, where they finally changed Ravan's ultimate into what it is today. Goodbye lock-on mechanic and hello 60% damage swing after ulting. Yes, upon this change, Ravan's ult just gave 50% mitigations to all incoming damage at all ranks, while also increasing the damage taken of his targets by 10%, so a 60% swing in total. The damage was also increased by 50 at all ranks, but finally this warrior designed for solo lane's ultimate was actually useful in a 1v1 scenario. Until this point, the target god still dealt full damage to you, where they now dealt 50% less and took 10% more. As I mentioned, this change undid all the nerfs Ravan had received since his rework, and he was once again a top pick ban. So in the following patches, he was slowly lowered down back to reality. Patch 4.8 nerfed the early game base damage of his 3, as well as the mitigations on his ult from 50% to 40%. Patch 4.17 once again nerfed the ultimate, as it now scaled up in mitigation from 20% to 40% instead of 40% at all ranks. The cooldown was also increased by 20 seconds at all ranks, one of the biggest cooldown increases I think I've ever seen. Oh, but they weren't done yet. At Season 5 launch, they once again hit the mitigation, so it was now 10% scaling to 30%. This ult just went from 90 seconds and 50% mitigation at rank 1 to 110 seconds and just 10% mitigation. A titanic power swing. After this, Ravan was left alone for a little while until the final big change happened to him to bring him into his modern design, his reclassification as an assassin. Patch 5.13 changed almost all of his base stats to be more damaging and less tanky. His passive finally stacked from every target hit with abilities. Before this, it only gave 1 stack per ability, so this was a huge buff to his sustain through the shield. While this shield also gained movement speed per stack, as it still holds today. The cooldown of his 2 was shifted to be less early game but more late game, and his 3's power scaling was increased to incentivize more power being built on him as he was now an assassin. This reclassification was definitely an overall buff, but Ravan still struggled after it. Whether that was due to the playstyle shift and people adjusting to assassin Ravan, or because of the copious nerfs he received beforehand, I don't know. But in the following patches, he got a few small buffs. 6.8 brought a reduced cooldown to his 3, 7.5 increased the base damage on his 1, and 9.6 increased the scaling on his 1 and 3, as well as the shield health from the original 5% to 7% per stack. At this point, Ravan was probably fine, but the buffs kept coming throughout year 10. 10.3 lowered the cooldown of his 2 to compensate for the game-wide healing reduction from this patch that affected his 3, and then 10.6 brought a lower cooldown to his 3 and yet another increase to his passive shield health, topping at 27% of his health bar in shields. The rest you probably know. Ravana has been a top meta solo laner since these buffs that were quite honestly unnecessary, and the max health buff on his shield has already been reverted back to 7%, which is still a lot more than the 5% he originally had before they buffed it in Season 9. But that's the story of Ravana's grand comeback, from the weakest release in the entire game with an ultimate that did less damage than a basic ability, no CC immunity on his 2 and a useless passive, to a dominant force after his rework in late Season 2, back to balance for a little bit before they changed the ultimate to its modern day variant, then into the trash can after several severe nerfs, and finally back into the meta after several buffs to his shielding and cooldowns in Season 9 and Year 10. More of a rise and fall than one grand comeback like Kuzumbo, but I suppose you could say his comeback was sort of complete in Season 4 after the ultimate changes. And he just bounced around between balanced and OP since then. Whose grand comeback should I cover next? Baba Yaga is definitely on the menu already, but let me know if there's any others you want me to take a look at for this series down below. Catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.